So now we'll be talking about the other sampling methods. So first things first, the systematic sample. So remember, these are the ways that we are getting our sample. So one way that you can do it is the systematic approach. So this is one that is obtained by selecting every kth individual from a population. Now, k is just a number. So this is essentially saying every fifth person, every sixth person, every 17th person, every third person, right? So basically you line people up in a line and you count off every fourth person. So that's a systematic approach. Hopefully not too hard. All right. Next, so for the next two, stratified and cluster, you need something called basically what I invented, which was the phrase pre-made groups. So this is something that I noticed with all of the different stratified and clustered samples, is that they had these things, what I noticed were called pre-made groups, which essentially are groups where that subjects are already in when they walk in the door. So what could that be? So that could be hair color, right? It could be eye color. It could be ethnicity. It could be religion. It could be location of where you live, so home location. And so many other things, right? Could be your gender. But yeah, so basically, these are groups that you walk in the door with, right? A subject will walk in the door with. So the person who is doing the experiment is not putting people into the groups. People are already in the groups. And some of these things you can change, right? You can change your eye color. You can change your hair, or you can't change your eye color, but you can change your hair color, right? You could change your religion or where you go home, or where your home is. But regardless, today we are all in different groups, right? And so basically the stratified and cluster method uses that pre-made group that we already are in to divide people up. So stratified is obtained by separating a population into smaller groups and then selecting some of the individuals from every group. So stratified is if you have all these groups, you're going to take a certain number from each of the groups. That's stratified. Cluster is the exact opposite. So you are selecting all of the individuals from some of the groups. So if you have some groups, right, you're going to take every single individual from some of the groups. And then you completely ignore the other two. All right, and then the last one we need to talk about before we can get to some examples is the convenience sample. So convenience is the one where individuals are easily obtained. So it can be you looking outside and just pointing at people nearest you. Hey, you, answer a question for me. So this is a terrible method, and it is very flawed. This is one that we do not want to do, because even though it is technically randomized, it's not going to have an even randomization. So remember, the entire point of a sample is so that you can determine stuff based off of a population. We'll keep saying this over and over in this class, but the reason why you have a sample is to make conclusions based off of the population, which means that you need your sample to look like your population, right? If the population is broken up like this, you also need your sample to try to be as broken up as that, right? So if you're just talking to all of the same type of person, Well, that's not going to be helpful at all, right? That's not going to be talking about the entire population. So we need to try to get as many different types of people as possible. So just doing it the laziest way is not going to be great. And this is one of the most popular examples today. So these are called the ones that are called voluntary response samples. These are super terrible. They're also known as self-selected studies. And they often produce bias because of those people who have a personal bias are the ones that are more likely to participate. So let's think about this for a second. What might be a voluntary response sample that you might have heard in your everyday life? So one of them that everyone uses these days are internet surveys, right? You probably see even on the news they post a question and they get the results, right? But by definition, this is a convenient sample and it is a flawed method, which means that any statistics found from these samples is meaningless. Because if you are in a self-selected study, right, only people who are super going to care about this are going to answer. So if you ask a question like, what's the best parenting styles? Right? There are some parents that are super opinionated, and they are absolutely going to answer this, right? There are some parents who really, are more laid back. They don't super care, or, they're doing their thing. You can do your thing, whatever, right? There's also single people that would need to be a part of this study, right? And have some sort of idea, because our population has single people with opinions about parenting styles. Now, whether they should be listened to or not is a whole nother thing, but they are included in the population and thus should be included as such, right? So, if the only people are going to be ones that super care, right? Well, we are missing single people. We're missing parents who don't care about telling other people what to do. We also just have individuals who don't do internet surveys. Right? There's a type of person who cares and would actually be passionate, and there's another type of person who would care and actually answer, right? There are people who just don't care about answering a survey, and they don't want to take the time to do that. So you're missing all these types of people, and we need to make sure to include every type of person in our studies. Let's look at some problems. All right, so which of these sampling methods, systematic, stratified, cluster, convenience, or simple random, is this? And I actually put this in the order that I personally like to determine. So typically, these are the easiest ways of determining a sampling method. Systematic is pretty easy. Then you have stratified and cluster, right? These have to have pre-made groups. So if it's not a systematic approach, done. If it's not, doesn't have any pre-made groups, done. Now we're down to just two different options, right? So if you have a checklist, this might be the one to use. This is the one I use. All right, part one. When collecting data from different sample locations in a lake, a researcher uses the line transit method by stretching a rope across the lake and collecting samples every 5 meters. So, which of these 5 is this sampling method? Well, hopefully you could see that this was the systematic approach, right? It's every 5 meters. So, you take 5 meters, you check it. 5 more meters, check it. 5 more meters, check it. Yeah, this is exactly what we were talking about with the systematic approach. All right. In a Pew Research survey, 1,007 adults were called after their telephone numbers were randomly generated by a computer, and 85% of the respondents were able to correctly identify what Twitter is. Okay, so remember, just because it says randomly does not mean it's simple random, right? All of these are random. So don't make that assumption. Just because it says randomly does not mean it's simple random. So let's go through it. All right, so is it systematic? Well, no, right? It's not every kth person, every fifth person, every seventh person, right? So not systematic. Does it have pre-made groups? Not really, right? I mean, I guess it's talking about people who have telephones, but if you notice, this would be the population, right? If they're only looking at people who have telephone numbers, then that's our population, everybody with telephone numbers. They're not looking at anybody without a telephone number. So no, it doesn't seem like there are any pre-made groups. So there is no, so this isn't stratified or cluster. And again, remember, this is why I said knowing what your population is super important for this class. All right, so now we're down to convenience and simple random. So which one is this? Well, some students kind of overthink it. In the past, I've noticed that this happens. So I wrote kind of a helpful hint to determine when is it going to be convenient and when is it going to be simple random. So ultimately, if you get it down to convenience or simple random, the convenience one is the flawed method. The simple random one is the sound method. But if you're still having issues determining whether your example is flawed or sound, here's kind of an easy, hopefully easy way to kind of think about it. So simple random is ultimately when the experimenter is doing all the work. So the person who's getting paid to do this study is going out and doing all this stuff. Where a convenient sample is ultimately when the subjects are doing all the work, right? So if you just put out an internet survey and you were expecting the subjects to answer it, right? Well, they're the ones that have to go out of their way to answer all these questions, right? They have to go to the website, they have to click on the thing, they have to answer all the questions, they have to submit it, right? So the experimenter isn't really doing much in that scenario. They just made the post and posted it. So in this scenario, right, who's doing all the work? Is it the subjects or is it the experimenter? Well, it says that 1,007 adults were called on their telephones after randomly generated by a computer. So sounds like the experimenter calls 1,007 adults. That is not no work, right? So all the subjects have to do is answer their phone, but the experimenter has to be the one to actually call all of these people. So this is actually a sound method. So this ends up being simple random. So I know earlier I said just because it's randomly generated doesn't mean it's simple random, and that's true, but in this case it actually was simple random. But like I said, it's not going to always be the case. All right, let's do another one. J.K. Rowling collected sample data by randomly selecting one sentence from each page of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, and then finding the number of words in each sentence of those pages. All right, so what is this, or what is this not? So we can pretty easily see that this is not systematic, right? That's why I always put that one first. It's easy to see, to either identify or cross out. So the next one, are there pre-made groups? So actually, yes, there are. So take a second, if you need to pause the video, what could the pre-made groups be? Well, another question would be, what are the subjects? Because remember, we said that subjects don't have to just be people. They could be cars, they could be tables, right? So in this case, the subjects would be the sentences, right? Which would mean that the group would be the page, right? Each sentence is on a page. So yeah, these actually do have pre-made groups, which means that it is either stratified or cluster. So which one is it? Is it stratified or is it cluster? Well, if we look at it, right, it's collected by selecting one sentence from each page of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. So you have your groups, and you're taking one sentence from each page. So what does that look like? That's stratified. Good. All right, next. The sexuality of women was discussed in the book Women and Love, A Cultural Revolution. Her conclusions were based on sample data that consisted of 4,500 mailed responses from 100,000 questionnaires that were sent to women. So what is this, or what is this not? So again, we can see not systematic, right? It's not every 12th person, every 15th person, right? Next, do they have pre-made groups? So some people, some students in the past have said, well, maybe it's gender, right? They're only, because they said they had questionnaires sent to women, so they're splitting the genders, we're simplifying things, but they're splitting up the genders into men and women. And they questioned 100,000 women. But let's think about this. Does that mean that that's gonna be stratified or cluster? What does stratified mean? Stratified means that you take some from everybody. Is that what's happening here? No, right? You don't take any from men. So then cluster. What is cluster? Remember, cluster is that you take everybody from one of the groups. That's what's happening. Well, there's not 100,000 women in the world, right? Yeah, so neither one of these is happening. And in actuality, there are no pre-made groups in this case. Why is that? Why are there no pre-made groups? So actually, if they're only talking to women, this is the population, right? Which makes sense. You don't want men mansplaining the sexuality of women, right? So the only population of this study is women. Yeah, and since we're not breaking up women into different categories, right, by location or by hair color, ethnicity, whatever, right? So since this isn't happening, there actually are no pre-made groups. So now we're back down to convenience or simple random. So which one is this? Is this a convenience method or is this a simple random method? Is this a flawed method or a sound method? Hopefully you can see that this is a flawed method, right? Because this is what we would call a voluntary response, which we said was convenience, right? Also, the experimenter is sending out 1,000 questionnaires, but are making the subjects mail back, right? So this is voluntary response as well. So the subjects are doing most of the work. They're the ones who are having to get a stamp, get a envelope, go to the post office, mail it, right, after they fill out all this stuff. And so since you're volunteering to do this, right, voluntary response. So this would be the convenience method, which is not great. And it means that unfortunately, any sort of statistics just doesn't matter in this case because it was a flawed method to begin with. All right, last one of this problem. On the day of the last presidential election, ABC News organized an exit poll in which specific polling stations were randomly selected and all voters were surveyed as they left the premises. So again, just because it says randomly selected does not mean it's simple random. So let's go through all of them. So, is it systematic? Obviously not, right? Not systematic. Not every kth person or kth pole or anything like that, right? All right, next, are there pre-made groups? So I'm actually going to say yes, there are this time. So what might the pre-made groups be? Well, again, what are the subjects? So in this case, the subjects would be the voters, right? So how are the voters partitioned? How are they grouped up? Well, each person has a polling station, right? Each voter has a polling station. So this would be their group. All right, so it seems like we have pre-made groups. So then the question is it going to be stratified or cluster? Well, it says that they went to polling stations. And these polling stations randomly selected and all voters were surveyed. So if we picked these two, right? Every single person was picked and surveyed. So which one is this? Hopefully you remember this is the cluster method. Good. All right. One more problem, and then we are done for today, for this lesson. All right. So for this one, if we choose 4 people randomly from a class, how would we select a sample using each of these methods? So actually, I would love if you just pause this video and tried on your own. This is typically what I would do in an actual classroom. I would just take a few minutes, let people kind of think about these. But I think that's going to be the best way of doing this. I can tell you all of them, and that's not going to be helpful, right? But you taking the time and really trying to think through how might I make a systematic sample for 4 people or a stratified sample for 4 people. All right. So go ahead, pause the video, try to figure that out. All right. So there are going to be multiple options for this. So yours might not look exactly like mine. If you are super unsure if yours does count, feel free to contact me and just ask. I would love to just answer that. That's no problem at all. So systematic, how could we get 4 people? So what we could do is we could line up the class and pick every 6th person, right? Until we get 4. We could get every 7th person, every 5th person, every 4th person, every 3rd person, every other person, right? But yeah, as long as we get 4 by the end of it, doesn't matter what the K number is, ultimately. All right, let's think stratified. So for a stratified one, we could simplify things and say, let's break people up into men and women, and then select 2 men and select 2 women. Another thing you could do is, I've heard break up into 4 hair colors. So if it's stratified and you want 4 people, you would need to have 4 different outcomes or some divisible, right? So you could have black hair, blonde hair, red hair, and other. And so you can just get 1 from each. And so that would be 4. So you couldn't say like brown, right? The last one couldn't be brown because you could also have someone with dyed hair, right? Someone with blue hair. So you just need to make sure to include everybody else, which would just be other. Good. So we're going to skip cluster for a second because that's probably the hardest one in this scenario. So let's just skip that for a second. So convenience. How could we get a sample of 4 people with a convenience system? We could just ask for 4 volunteers, right? That's the voluntary response. Terrible way of doing things, but that would be a convenience sample. All right, what about simple random? So we could place everybody's name in a hat and pick out 4. Right? Good. So also, side note, so we talked in the last video about simple random samples, right? And we said that some of the definitions were pretty tricky. And so there was a simpler way of doing it, a shortcut way of doing it. So basically, the way to do this is actually what we've already sort of talked about, but just not explicitly. So a sample also is simple random if it's not any of the other samples, right? So if you want to determine if it's simple random, you can see, is it stratified? Is it cluster? Is it convenience? Is it systematic? No. Well, then in this class, it's going to be simple random. So that can be another way of doing it. And actually, if you go back and look at the examples we did in the previous video, you will see the ones that we did not include for simple random. I believe one of them was a stratified method. One of them was a convenience method because we asked for volunteers. One of them was stratified, broke up people into men and women. So, all right, cluster. So cluster's a little harder because it might depend on how the classroom is set up if you're in a classroom, and it might depend on how many groups of people we have, right? Because, so think about this. If you broke up people into, once again, into hair color. Well, if you have 20 people with black hair, 1 person with blonde hair, 3 people, 1 person with red hair, and 1 person with blue hair, right? There's no way that you can just pick a sample of these to get 4 people, right? Because if you chose people with black hair, well, that's 20 people. That's over the 4. If you chose these, well, that's only 3 people. So again, we don't have our 4. So you would need to have some sort of grouping where people are already, where you end up with 4 people and not any other number, right? So that's why this one's a little harder. So I do know that in one of my classes, people were sitting in rows of 4 people. So when we actually looked at the classroom, most of them, like, we were in rows of 4. So then we just chose 1 row. So we kind of did this by grouping by location, which I think is probably going to be the easiest way of doing it. The other way you could do it is just pair students off by location. So where they're sitting, right? And then just choose 2 rows or 2 groups. Yeah, this one's not super great because you are technically putting them into groups, but I guess since it's by location, we can just let it go. This one actually ended up just being perfect. Everyone ended up sitting on their own, they were sitting in rows of 4, and I just chose 1 row. That was the perfect way of doing this. But yeah, also if you had a group, right? So if you did have it where there was only 4 people in one of these groups, so if you only had 4 women or 4 men, that would be an easy way of doing it. If you only had 4 people who had blonde hair, that would be an easy way of doing it, right? So that might just depend specifically on the class that you were in, which is why it was a little harder to do. All right, well, that's the end of this video. So as always, if you have any questions, definitely let me know.